Daniel didn't leave much worth keeping, so I went ahead and took care of his things, my daughter-in-law said, folding her hands on the kitchen table as if she were talking about old winter coats instead of my son's entire life. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. The afternoon light coming through the blinds striped the hardwood floor in pale gold lines, and the house still smelled faintly of the coffee I had brewed that morning, the same way I had every Sunday for the past 30 years. I was 72 years old, and I had buried my only son just 6 weeks earlier. I was still sleeping on my side of the bed, still setting 2 plates out of habit before remembering there was no one else to eat. And now I was being told that his belongings had been taken care of. I kept my hands folded in my lap so she wouldn't see them tremble. Taken care of? I repeated, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Ashley nodded, her expression calm, almost efficient. He wouldn't have wanted clutter, Margaret. I sold most of it. The truck, the tools, the watch collection. There was interest online. It's better this way. Better. The word echoed in my mind like a hollow knock on an empty door. Daniel's blue Ford F-150 had been parked in that driveway since he was 28 years old. I remembered the day he brought it home, grinning like a boy who had just learned to ride a bike without training wheels. His tools were not clutter. They were lined up with care in the garage, each wrench and drill placed exactly where he could reach it. His watches were gifts he had saved for, one from his first real paycheck, another from the year he paid off his student loans. I had not been asked. I had not been told. I had simply been erased from the process. I looked around the kitchen, at the small ceramic rooster on the windowsill and the worn oak cabinets Daniel had refinished for me one summer when he was home between jobs. When did you do this? I asked. Last week, she said lightly. There was no reason to drag it out. Last week. I had been at the cemetery last week, standing in front of a headstone that still looked too new against the grass. I had brought white lilies because they were his favorite, and I had talked to him in a whisper, telling him I was trying to be strong. While I was there, she had been arranging buyers, negotiating prices, watching strangers carry pieces of his life down the driveway. A strange stillness settled over me then, not the sharp sting of anger, but something colder and heavier. I imagined the garage now, empty except for dust outlines where his workbench had stood. I imagined the closet upstairs, hangers spaced too far apart. You should have told me, I said quietly. Ashley shrugged, not unkindly, just dismissively. I didn't think it would matter. You don't need those things. She was right about one thing. I did not need the truck or the tools or the watches. What I needed was the feeling that my son's life had weight, that it could not be boxed up and sold like unwanted furniture. I rose from my chair slowly, steadying myself against the edge of the table. Is everything gone? I asked. Almost, she said. There were a few papers I didn't bother with. Just old documents. Old documents. My heart gave a slow, deliberate beat. Daniel had always been meticulous with paperwork. Even as a teenager, he kept folders labeled in careful block letters. I nodded once, as if satisfied, and walked down the hallway toward his old room. The carpet felt softer than I remembered, the air cooler. When I opened the door, the space seemed larger, stripped of the familiar clutter that had once made it feel alive. The shelves were bare. The desk drawers were empty. But on the bottom shelf of the closet, pushed slightly behind a stack of unused picture frames, was a small brown envelope. My name was written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. For Mom. Only Mom. I closed the door behind me and held the envelope in both hands. Whatever Ashley had sold, whatever she had decided was disposable, she had missed this. And as I traced the curve of my son's letters with my fingertip, I understood that she had not taken care of everything after all. I did not open the envelope right away. I sat down on the edge of Daniel's bed, the mattress dipping under my weight the same way it had when he was a teenager coming home from high school, tossing his backpack on the floor and talking about math tests and baseball practice. The room felt unfamiliar now, stripped of the quiet chaos that once made it his. The air carried only the faint scent of old wood and dust. I ran my thumb along the sealed edge of the envelope, tracing his handwriting again, steady and deliberate. For Mom. Only Mom. Those 3 words felt heavier than anything that had been carried out of this house. Down the hallway, I could hear Ashley moving dishes in the kitchen, the soft clink of ceramic against ceramic. Ordinary sounds. Domestic sounds. The kind that make a house seem calm and orderly. But nothing about this house felt orderly to me anymore. I thought about the garage, about the empty space where his workbench had stood. I pictured strangers handing over cash, loading his tools into the back of their vehicles, driving away without knowing the man who had once held those tools with care. I had not even been given the chance to keep something small, something simple, like the flannel shirt he wore every fall when the Ohio air turned crisp and the leaves on our street began to burn orange and red. I slid my finger under the flap and opened the envelope carefully, as if it might tear under the weight of my anticipation. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and a smaller card tucked behind it. I unfolded the letter first. Daniel's handwriting filled the page in neat lines. He began by telling me he loved me. He thanked me for teaching him how to balance a checkbook, how to plant tomatoes in the backyard every May, how to treat people with respect even when they did not return it. My vision blurred for a moment, and I had to blink slowly to keep reading. Then his tone shifted. He wrote that if I was reading this, it meant things had not gone the way he had hoped. He wrote that he had made copies of certain documents and placed them where I would find them if I ever needed to. He wrote that some of his belongings were not to be sold without my consent because they were connected to family assets that predated his marriage. My heart beat louder in my ears. Family assets. I read that line twice. Daniel had always been practical. Even when he fell in love, he remained thoughtful about finances, about responsibility. The smaller card behind the letter contained a safe deposit box number and the name of our local bank in town, the same one my late husband and I had used for more than 40 years. He had underlined the words, just in case. I lowered the paper into my lap and stared at the pale blue walls of his room. Just in case. That meant he had anticipated something. That meant he had seen a possibility that I had refused to see. I thought about Ashley's calm voice at the kitchen table, about the way she had said it was better this way, about how easily she had dismissed the past as clutter. I felt a slow clarity settle over me, not sharp, not explosive, but steady and deliberate. I folded the letter carefully along its original creases and slipped it back into the envelope. Whatever had been sold could not be undone in this moment, but whatever Daniel had prepared, whatever he had trusted me to handle, was still within my reach. I rose from the bed, smoothing the front of my sweater, and placed the envelope inside my purse. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt purpose. The next morning I woke before the sun rose, the house wrapped in that quiet gray light that comes just before dawn in early October. I lay still for a few seconds, listening to the steady hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a delivery truck somewhere down the street. For weeks, I had woken up with the same heavy thought pressing against my chest. But this morning, there was something else beneath it. Not hope, not anger, something steadier. I reached for my purse on the nightstand and felt the edge of the envelope inside, solid and real. Daniel had trusted me with something. That meant I needed to move carefully. At breakfast, Ashley was already dressed, scrolling through her phone with a cup of coffee in her hand. I am heading into town later, I said, keeping my tone neutral as I poured myself a cup. I need to stop by the bank. She glanced up briefly. What for? The question was quick, almost automatic. I met her eyes. Old accounts. Things your father-in-law and I set up years ago. That part was true. She hesitated for half a second, then shrugged. All right. Just let me know if you need anything. If I need anything. The words felt thin. After she left the house, I stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the empty driveway where Daniel's truck used to sit. The concrete was clean now, no oil stains, no tire marks. As if he had never parked there at all. I locked the front door and drove my sedan into town, passing the same grocery store and post office I had known for decades. The bank building stood on the corner of Main Street, brick exterior, American flag moving gently in the breeze. I had walked through those doors countless times with my husband. Today, I walked in alone, but not uncertain. The air inside smelled faintly of polished wood and printer ink. A young teller greeted me with a polite smile, and I asked to speak with someone about a safe deposit box. When I gave Daniel's full name and the box number from the card, the clerk's expression shifted slightly, professional but attentive. Please have a seat, Mrs. Collins, she said. I sat in a leather chair near the window, watching cars roll past at 25 miles per hour, watching ordinary life continue as if nothing in my world had changed. After a few minutes, a middle-aged man in a navy suit approached and introduced himself as the branch manager. He spoke gently when he mentioned Daniel, offering condolences that sounded sincere. I nodded and handed him the card. My son left instructions, I said. I believe I am authorized to access this box. He reviewed the information, typed something into his computer, and then looked back at me. Yes, ma'am. You are listed as a co-holder. Co-holder. My hands rested calmly in my lap, but inside, something aligned. Daniel had not acted on impulse. He had prepared. The manager escorted me to the vault, a heavy steel door swinging open with a muted mechanical sound. He retrieved the narrow metal box and placed it on a small private table. When he stepped away, leaving me alone in that quiet room, I exhaled slowly. I slid the box open. Inside were neatly organized folders, each labeled in Daniel's careful handwriting. Property records, insurance policies, copies of purchase receipts for items I now knew had been sold. And beneath them, a sealed envelope addressed to our longtime family attorney, Thomas Reynolds. My name was written below it in smaller letters. I understood then that what had been taken from this house might not be the final chapter. Daniel had left a trail, and I was no longer standing in the dark. I did not remove the folders from the safe deposit box right away. I sat there for a moment in the small private room of the bank vault, the fluorescent light humming softly above me, and I ran my fingers over Daniel's handwriting. Each label was straight, evenly spaced, written in the careful print he had used since he was a boy learning to form his letters at our kitchen table. Property records, insurance, personal assets. He had not thrown words around loosely. If he had labeled something personal assets, then he had meant something specific. I opened the envelope addressed to Thomas Reynolds, but did not break the seal. My name was written beneath his in smaller letters, as if Daniel had wanted to make sure there would be no confusion about who was meant to act. I slipped the folders back into the box in the same neat order and closed the lid. I was not going to rush this. I had lived long enough to know that haste rarely serves the truth. After locking the box back into place, I thanked the branch manager and stepped out onto Main Street. The air was cooler now, a steady autumn breeze brushing against my coat. I stood there for a moment watching people cross the street, carrying grocery bags, talking on their phones, living ordinary lives. None of them knew that my son had anticipated something I had refused to see. I drove directly to Thomas Reynolds' office, a modest brick building 2 blocks from the courthouse. He had handled our wills, our home deed, and the small investment account my husband and I built over 40 years. His receptionist recognized me immediately and ushered me into his office with a quiet expression of sympathy. Thomas stood when I entered, his hair grayer than I remembered, but his posture still straight. "Margaret," he said gently, "I was sorry to hear about Daniel." I nodded once and placed the sealed envelope on his desk. "He left this in a safe deposit box. It is addressed to you." Thomas examined the envelope, recognizing Daniel's handwriting. He opened it carefully and read in silence. I watched his expression shift from condolence to concentration. When he finished, he folded the letter back into place and looked at me steadily. "Your son updated certain documents 6 months ago," he said. He designated several items as separate property connected to pre-marriage family funds. He also specified that any sale of those items would require your written consent. I felt the room grow very still. "They have already been sold," I said quietly. Thomas's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in focus. "Then we will need to review the transactions. If assets classified under that agreement were sold without proper authorization, there may be legal remedies." Legal remedies. The phrase did not sound dramatic. It sounded procedural, precise. He pulled a file from his cabinet and laid out copies of documents Daniel had signed, including a notarized addendum attached to his will. I recognized the date. It was from early spring, long before the illness that took him so suddenly. He had not acted in panic. He had acted with clarity. Did he explain why? I asked. Thomas paused before answering. He expressed concern about financial disagreements in his marriage. He wanted to ensure certain family assets remained protected. I thought of Ashley's calm voice at my kitchen table, the way she had said I did not need those things. I had mistaken confidence for transparency. I had mistaken efficiency for honesty. Thomas slid the papers toward me. "Margaret, you have options, but you must decide how you wish to proceed." I gathered the documents slowly, feeling the weight of them in my hands. For weeks, I had felt like a guest in my own home, like a woman drifting through rooms that no longer belonged to her. Now I understood something simple and solid. Daniel had not left me defenseless. He had left me prepared. When I stepped back into my house that afternoon, nothing looked different, yet everything had shifted. The same beige sofa sat beneath the front window, the same family photographs lined the hallway wall, but I no longer felt like a woman waiting to be informed. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and laid the copies Thomas had given me beside it, smoothing the edges with my palm. The documents were not dramatic. They were typed in plain legal language, dated, signed, notarized. Clear. That clarity steadied me. Ashley's car was already in the driveway. I could hear the faint sound of the television in the living room, some daytime talk show murmuring in the background. I walked in slowly, not hurried, not tense. She looked up from the couch, remote in hand. "You were gone a while," she said. I nodded. I had several things to review. I did not elaborate. I did not need to. For the first time, I noticed a flicker of curiosity in her expression, the kind that comes when control is no longer certain. I went into the kitchen and began preparing dinner as I always had, slicing vegetables, setting a pot of water to boil, measuring rice with the same 1-cup scoop Daniel used when he learned to cook for himself in college. Routine can be powerful. It signals normalcy even when the ground beneath you has changed. While the rice simmered, I carried the folder into the dining room and sat at the table. I began making a list in my neat cursive handwriting. Blue Ford F-150 truck. Antique watch collection. Professional woodworking tools. Each item matched against the documentation Daniel had preserved. I wrote down approximate market values based on the receipts and appraisals included in the file. The numbers were not small. They represented years of work, years of intention. Ashley walked into the room, drawn perhaps by the silence. "What is all that?" she asked, glancing at the papers. I looked up calmly. "Records," I said. Daniel updated certain documents before he passed. Her shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Updated how?" she asked. I held her gaze, not accusing, not emotional. He designated some assets as protected under family agreements. Sales required written authorization. The room grew very quiet. The ticking of the wall clock sounded louder than usual. "I did not know anything about that," she replied quickly. "We handled things together." I nodded slowly. It appears he handled some things separately. I did not raise my voice. I did not repeat myself. The words were enough. She crossed her arms lightly, a defensive posture she likely did not even realize she had adopted. "Are you saying I did something wrong?" she asked. I folded the top sheet back into place. "I am saying we will be reviewing the transactions," I answered. "With proper guidance." I did not mention legal remedies. I did not mention possible consequences. I simply let the weight of the documentation speak for itself. She opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. For weeks, she had spoken with certainty, making decisions in quick, decisive tones. Now, uncertainty entered the room like a quiet third presence. I stood and carried the folder back to my purse. "Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes, I said evenly. As I stirred the pot on the stove, I felt no triumph. There was no satisfaction in this moment. There was only balance returning to its rightful place. Daniel had anticipated a fracture. He had placed tools in my hands, not tools made of metal or wood, but tools made of preparation and foresight. And for the first time since I stood at his graveside beneath the gray Ohio sky, I no longer felt like something fragile that could be moved without permission. The next morning the house felt different, not louder, not colder, just aware. I moved through it slowly, as if the walls themselves were listening. Ashley avoided the dining room where the papers had been spread out the night before. She kept to the living room, her phone in her hand more often than usual, her voice low when she stepped outside to take calls. I did not ask who she was speaking to. I did not need to. I had already scheduled another appointment with Thomas Reynolds for later that week. He had requested copies of the sales listings, bank transfers, and any communication related to the items that had been sold. That meant details, dates, numbers, proof. After breakfast, I walked into the garage. The emptiness struck me again, but this time I did not focus on what was missing. I focused on what remained. Faint rectangular outlines on the concrete floor marked where Daniel's workbench once stood. A few stray screws glittered near the corner. On a high shelf, a small metal toolbox had been overlooked, likely because it appeared ordinary. I reached up carefully and brought it down, setting it on the hood of my car. Inside were receipts folded neatly, some dating back 5 or 6 years. Daniel had kept copies of purchases for his tools, his truck accessories, even custom parts he had ordered online. Each receipt had a date and a method of payment. I gathered them into a folder and carried them inside. Ashley watched me from the hallway. "Are you reorganizing?" she asked, her tone casual but tight around the edges. "I am documenting," I replied evenly. "For clarity." She crossed her arms lightly. "I already told you. Everything was sold at fair market value. We needed liquidity." The word liquidity sounded rehearsed. I met her eyes. "Liquidity does not override agreements," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply placed the receipts on the kitchen table and began matching them with the list I had written. The truck alone had been worth more than she had implied. The watch collection had been appraised 2 years earlier for insurance purposes at a figure that made my chest tighten. I remembered the day Daniel showed me the appraisal, proud not of the value but of the discipline it had taken him to build something meaningful over time. By early afternoon, I had assembled a clear outline of what had been sold and approximately for how much. When Thomas called to confirm our meeting, I provided him with the preliminary figures. There was a pause on the line. "Margaret," he said carefully, "if these items were classified as protected property, the proceeds may not legally belong solely to the estate as it is currently being handled." I understood what he was saying without him needing to say more. When I hung up, I found Ashley standing in the doorway. "You spoke to a lawyer again," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I answered. "I did." Her jaw tightened. "This does not have to become adversarial." I looked at her steadily, noticing for the first time a flicker of uncertainty behind her composure. "Clarity is not adversarial," I said quietly. "It is necessary." The silence between us stretched, not explosive, not dramatic, just firm. She had assumed that grief would keep me passive, that age would make me hesitant. But grief had sharpened me, not softened me. That evening, as I filed the documents neatly into a binder, I realized something important. This was no longer about reclaiming objects. It was about restoring boundaries. Daniel had drawn them before he passed. I was simply tracing the lines he left behind. 2 days later, I sat across from Thomas Reynolds again, the binder of documents resting on his polished oak desk. Sunlight filtered through the tall office windows, casting long rectangular shapes across the carpet. I had dressed carefully that morning in a navy cardigan and pressed slacks, not to impress anyone, but to remind myself that I was not fragile. Thomas reviewed the receipts and sales records I had gathered, making notes in the margin with a fountain pen. "The dates matter," he said quietly. "Several of these items were sold after Daniel's updated designation was filed and notarized." I nodded. "And that designation required my written consent." He met my eyes. "Yes, it did." There was no drama in his tone, only certainty. He explained that if protected assets had been liquidated without authorization, the proceeds could be subject to recovery or reimbursement. He would begin by sending a formal notice requesting a detailed accounting of the transactions and the current location of the funds. The phrase detailed accounting felt precise and unyielding. I appreciated that. I did not want noise. I wanted clarity. When I returned home that afternoon, Ashley was standing at the kitchen counter, a stack of mail spread in front of her. She looked up immediately. "Did you meet with him again?" she asked. I set my purse down gently. "Yes," I said. "A formal notice will be sent requesting documentation of the sales and where the proceeds were deposited." Her face paled slightly. "Margaret, this is unnecessary. We were married. Those things were part of our shared property." I kept my voice even. "Some were. Some were not." She shook her head. "Daniel would not have wanted this to turn into paperwork and legal letters." I felt a quiet steadiness rise inside me. "Daniel prepared the paperwork," I replied. "He wanted protection. I am honoring that." The silence that followed was thick but controlled. She began pacing slowly, her hands moving as she spoke. "We needed funds. Medical bills. Mortgage payments. You know how expensive everything is." I didn't know. I had paid a mortgage for 30 years. I had balanced grocery budgets down to the dollar when my husband's hours were cut during a recession. "Need does not erase agreement," I said softly. "If you had spoken to me first, this would be a different conversation." She stopped pacing and looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Not as a grieving mother sitting quietly at the edge of the room. Not as an aging woman to be managed, but as someone who understood signatures and dates and consequences. "What happens now?" she asked. The question held less certainty than before. "Now we wait for transparency," I said. That evening, I walked into the backyard just before sunset. The maple tree Daniel planted when he bought this house rustled gently in the breeze. The grass needed trimming, and the garden beds were overgrown, but the structure of the yard remained intact. I stood there thinking about how easy it is to mistake silence for weakness. For weeks, I had been quiet because grief demanded it. But quiet does not mean unaware. It does not mean unprepared. Inside the house, I could hear Ashley moving from room to room, her footsteps quick, restless. A formal letter would arrive soon, printed on heavy paper, requesting figures and explanations. It would not shout. It would not accuse. It would simply require answers. As the sun dipped below the rooftops of our Ohio neighborhood, I realized something important. The balance of this house had shifted again, not through raised voices or slammed doors, but through ink on paper and the calm refusal to be dismissed. The formal notice arrived 3 days later in a thick white envelope with Thomas Reynolds's name printed neatly in the upper left corner. I was at the kitchen table when the mail carrier slid it through the slot in the front door. The sound was small, almost ordinary, but it carried weight. I picked it up and placed it beside my teacup without opening it. It was not addressed to me. It was addressed to Ashley. When she came downstairs an hour later, dressed for an appointment she had not mentioned, I handed it to her calmly. "This came for you," I said. She looked at the return address and froze for half a second before tearing the envelope open. I watched her eyes move across the page, watched the color drain slowly from her face. The letter requested a full accounting of the sale of specific assets, documentation of sale prices, copies of transfer records, and clarification regarding the current location of the proceeds. It cited the notarized designation Daniel had filed and referenced my co-holder status connected to certain properties. There was no accusation in the wording, only structure, only expectation. "This is ridiculous," she said finally, lowering the paper. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be." I folded my hands together on the table. "I am making it accurate," I replied. She paced once across the kitchen tile and back. "We needed that money. The hospital bills alone were over $80,000. The mortgage is $2,000 a month." I was trying to stay afloat. Her voice trembled, but whether from fear or frustration I could not tell. "And you may have had every right to sell what belonged solely to you," I said evenly, "but not what required consent." She stopped moving. "Daniel never said you had a claim," she insisted. I held her gaze. He did not need to say it. He documented it. That was the difference. Words fade. Ink remains. She sank into a chair and stared at the letter again, as if rereading it might change the language. I did not feel triumph. I felt a quiet sadness that it had come to this. I had welcomed her into this family 12 years ago. I had helped plan her wedding, cooked Thanksgiving dinners, held her hand in hospital waiting rooms. But welcome does not mean surrender. Later that afternoon, she made several phone calls from the living room, her tone tight and controlled. I could hear phrases like transfer records and joint account and temporary measures. I did not interrupt. I sat at the dining room table organizing my binder, aligning receipts with appraisals, highlighting dates that matched the designation Daniel had signed. The pattern was clear. Several high-value items had been sold within weeks of his passing, and the proceeds had been deposited into an account I did not recognize. That account was not listed in any of the shared financial summaries Daniel had once shown me. When Ashley ended her last call, she stood in the doorway again. "If I provide the records, what then?" she asked quietly. "Then we determine what belongs where," I said, "and we correct what does not." She studied my face, perhaps searching for anger she could respond to. There was none, only steadiness. The house felt smaller that evening, not because of raised voices, but because the truth had narrowed the space between us. Transparency was no longer optional. It had been formally requested, printed in black ink on white paper, backed by signatures and dates. And for the first time since Daniel's belongings began disappearing from this home, I knew the next move would not be decided in whispers. It would be decided in records. The records began arriving in stages. At first, it was a single printed spreadsheet placed on the kitchen counter, then a folder left on the dining room table, Then a stack of bank statements slid quietly toward me without comment. Ashley did not hand them to me directly. She placed them within reach, as if proximity alone satisfied obligation. I gathered each document without expression and added it to my binder. The figures were clearer now. The truck had sold for less than its appraised value. The watch collection had been broken up and sold individually through online listings. The woodworking tools had gone to 3 separate buyers. Each transaction was marked by a transfer into an account ending in numbers I did not recognize. I brought the full set of records to Thomas Reynolds the following afternoon. He reviewed them slowly, calculating totals on a legal pad, comparing dates against the notarized designation Daniel had signed. The proceeds from protected assets were deposited into an account solely in her name, he said finally. That creates a distinction. I listened carefully. What kind of distinction? I asked. He folded his hands. It separates shared estate management from unilateral action. That matters. He drafted a second letter that same day, outlining the discrepancy and requesting the portion connected to protected assets be transferred into a temporary holding account pending formal allocation. The language remained calm, precise, unemotional. When I returned home, Ashley was waiting at the dining room table, the earlier confidence in her posture replaced by visible strain. He wants the money moved, she said, holding up a copy of the new letter. He wants the portion connected to designated assets placed in escrow, I corrected gently. Pending review. She stood up abruptly, then steadied herself against the chair. This feels like you are taking everything from me, she said. I studied her for a moment before answering. I am taking nothing. I am restoring what was separated. The distinction was not just legal. It was moral. Daniel had anticipated confusion. He had drawn lines. I was following them. Over the next 48 hours, arrangements were made. Funds were transferred under formal supervision. Statements were updated. Thomas confirmed the receipt of the allocated amount into the holding account. The total connected to protected assets was substantial, more than I had expected, enough to explain why Daniel had been meticulous. That evening, I walked through the house again, noticing small details I had overlooked before. The indentation in the carpet where the sofa once sat before we rearranged the room. The faint outline on the garage floor where the truck had been parked for years. Loss leaves traces, but so does correction. Ashley remained distant, moving through the house with clipped efficiency. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, only the quiet consequence of paperwork executed properly. I sat at the dining room table with my binder open in front of me and allowed myself a slow breath. The balance sheet now reflected something closer to truth. Not perfect, not complete, but aligned. Daniel had trusted that if circumstances required it, I would stand where he could not. And as I closed the binder and turned off the dining room light, I understood that the shift in this house was no longer subtle. Authority had returned to structure, and structure does not bend to convenience. The house settled into a new rhythm after the funds were placed in escrow. It was quieter, not because there were fewer sounds, but because there were fewer assumptions. Ashley no longer moved through the rooms with automatic authority. She moved carefully, as if each step required thought. I continued my routines without alteration. I rose at 6:30 each morning, brewed my coffee, opened the curtains in the living room, and watered the small fern by the window. Stability can be its own statement. A week after the transfer, Thomas requested a joint meeting to finalize allocation and clarify remaining responsibilities tied to the estate. We agreed to meet at his office on a Friday afternoon. The sky that day was pale and overcast, the kind of Ohio sky that feels undecided between rain and sun. Ashley and I drove separately. In the waiting room, we sat in opposite chairs, a small glass table between us holding outdated magazines. Neither of us spoke. When Thomas called us in, he laid out the summary clearly. The protected assets had been identified. The corresponding funds were now secure. After deducting documented shared expenses that were legitimately tied to medical and household obligations, the remaining balance connected to those assets would be formally reassigned according to Daniel's designation. Ashley listened without interrupting. She no longer argued that everything had been shared. The documents were too clear for that. Instead, she asked practical questions. How would the reassignment be reflected in final estate records? What tax implications might follow? Thomas answered each one patiently. I watched her carefully. There was no defiance left, only recalculation. When the paperwork was signed, the sound of pen against paper felt decisive. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. Outside the office, Ashley paused near the curb. "I did not expect this," she said quietly. I considered her words before responding. "Neither did I said. "But expectations do not override preparation." She nodded once, looking out toward the courthouse across the street. "What happens now?" she asked again, though the tone was different from before. Less confrontational, more uncertain. "Now we move forward with clarity," I replied. That evening, I returned to the house alone. Ashley had chosen to stay with a friend for a few days, needing space, she said. I did not object. I walked through each room slowly, noticing how the air felt lighter. The escrow account would soon be converted into its proper allocation. The records would reflect Daniel's intent accurately. The imbalance had been corrected through process, not pressure. I stood in the garage again, looking at the empty space where the truck once stood. The concrete was still bare, but the emptiness no longer felt like defeat. It felt like evidence of a lesson learned. Objects can disappear. Paper can restore order. I closed the garage door gently and turned off the light. For weeks, I had been responding. Now I was no longer reacting to what had been taken. I was standing firmly on what had been preserved. And in that quiet Ohio evening, with the maple tree rustling outside and the house steady around me, I understood that the true shift had not been financial. It had been positional. I was no longer on the margins of my own family story. I was exactly where Daniel had intended me to stand. When Ashley returned 3 days later, she did not carry the same certainty she once had. She brought a small suitcase up the front steps and paused before unlocking the door, as if measuring the weight of the house itself. I was in the kitchen slicing apples for a pie, the scent of cinnamon filling the air. It was late October now, and the evenings in Ohio turned dark before 6 o'clock. Routine remained my anchor. She stepped inside quietly. "I will be moving out by the end of the month," she said after setting her suitcase near the stairs. The words were controlled, but they carried finality. I did not stop slicing. "Have you found a place?" I asked. She nodded. "An apartment about 15 miles from here. It is smaller, but it will be mine." There was something honest in that sentence. Not defensive, not argumentative, simply stated. I placed the apple slices into a bowl and wiped my hands on a towel before turning to face her fully. "I hope it brings you peace," I said. She looked surprised by the absence of bitterness. "I did not mean for things to turn out like this," she added, her voice lower than before. "I believe that in a limited way. Intent and impact rarely match." "Daniel prepared carefully," I replied. "He believed in clarity." She glanced around the kitchen, at the cabinets he had refinished years ago, at the dining table where so many holidays had unfolded. "I felt alone after he was gone," she admitted. Everything was overwhelming. Bills, decisions, silence. I understood that part more than she realized. Grief can make urgency feel like survival, but urgency does not replace integrity. "You were not alone," I said gently. "You chose not to ask." The statement was calm, not accusatory. She absorbed it without argument. Over the next week, she packed her belongings steadily. Boxes lined the hallway. The house echoed differently as her things disappeared. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices. Only the quiet acknowledgement that the foundation beneath us had shifted permanently. On her final morning in the house, she stood in the doorway of the living room holding a small framed photograph of Daniel. "May I take this?" she asked. I looked at the photograph, taken on a summer afternoon when he was laughing at something off camera, sunlight catching in his hair. "Yes," I said. "You may." She hesitated before adding, "Thank you for not making this worse." I met her eyes steadily. "I did not need to," I answered. After she drove away, the driveway felt wide and empty, but not hollow. I walked through each room slowly, taking in the quiet. The escrow allocation had been finalized. The records were complete. The boundaries Daniel had drawn were respected. I stood in the center of the living room and allowed myself a long, steady breath. I had not shouted. I had not pleaded. I had not surrendered. I had simply stood firm in the space that was mine to occupy. Outside, the maple leaves drifted across the lawn, catching in small golden piles along the sidewalk. Law still lived in this house. It would always live here. But it no longer shared space with uncertainty. What remained was structure. And structure, once restored, does not easily collapse. On the first Sunday after Ashley moved out, I woke before sunrise and walked into the living room with my coffee, the house wrapped in a stillness that no longer felt tense. The escrow accounts had been properly allocated. The final paperwork had been filed. Daniel's intentions were reflected in every record that now sat neatly organized inside the fireproof box in my bedroom closet. Nothing dramatic had happened. No doors had been slammed. No voices had echoed down the hallway. And yet everything had changed. I stood by the front window and looked out at the quiet Ohio street. The maple tree in the yard nearly bare now, its leaves scattered across the lawn like small reminders of a season that had completed its work. Months earlier, I had stood in this same spot feeling erased, as if decisions were being made around me rather than with me. I had questioned my own place in the story of my son's life. But now I understood something clearly. Presence is not measured by volume. It is measured by steadiness. Later that morning, I drove to the cemetery with a small bouquet of white lilies, the same kind I had brought the week after his funeral. The air was cold enough to see my breath as I walked across the grass. I stood in front of Daniel's headstone and placed the flowers gently at its base. I handled it, I said quietly. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of autumn earth. I did not speak about money. I did not speak about conflict. I spoke about alignment. About how the documents he prepared had been honored. About how the boundaries he drew had been respected. For the first time since his passing, my words did not tremble. They felt anchored. I thought back to the day Ashley told me she had taken care of his things. I remembered the hollow feeling in my chest, the way I had questioned whether my role in his life had quietly expired the moment he did. But that was never true. A mother's place does not vanish because someone else rearranges the furniture. It does not dissolve because someone else makes a sale. It endures in preparation, in memory, in the quiet courage to stand where you are meant to stand. When I returned home that afternoon, I opened the garage and stood once more in the empty space where his truck had been parked for years. The concrete was still bare, but I no longer saw absence. I saw proof that even when objects leave, intention can remain. I closed the garage door slowly and walked back into the house, turning on the lamp beside the sofa as evening settled in. The light filled the room with a soft glow, warm and steady. I sat down and allowed the silence to settle around me. Not heavy, not uncertain, just complete. I had not raised my voice. I had not demanded acknowledgement. I had simply refused to be erased. And in doing so, I reclaimed more than assets. I reclaimed position. I reclaimed clarity. I reclaimed the quiet authority of a woman who knows exactly where she stands. Daniel had trusted that if the moment required it, I would stand firm. And I did. Not loudly, not bitterly, but fully.